Okay, welcome everyone tonight to another episode of the Paterson Museum Foundation's lecture series. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation, which is a 501c3, effectively a friends group to the Paterson Museum. We support the museum in a variety of ways, item acquisition, conservation. Some of you may have seen on Facebook, we're actually in the process of hopefully putting a large steel train shed over the two locomotives outside. So we really try to help the museum in a variety of ways. And one of the things we did several months ago was get into the business of doing lectures online, specifically Zoom webinar lectures. So they've been very popular. We hope you enjoy the one tonight. The previous episodes that we've had have all been posted on YouTube on the Paterson Museum's own YouTube channel. So if you go on the Facebook page for the museum, you'll see links to that there. We have two series, actually. We have this one, which is a speaker series. We also have another series featuring Ed Smike, and it's called Stories Behind the Story, Conversations with the Passaic County historian Ed Smike. He has a couple new episodes coming up here in the next couple months, one which will involve Mark Twain's visit to Paterson back in the late 19th century. And also, I believe we're going to do one on John Reed, the photographer of Paterson, talking about him. So please follow us on that Facebook page for future episodes of these different webinar installments. One last point, we are, again, a 501c3. So later on in the chat room, I will put up a link to our PayPal account. If any of you feel so inclined to would like to donate to us, all the money, we're all volunteers, all the money goes to these variety of activities that we help the museum out with. So we'd appreciate that. So one last thing, if any of you have questions for tonight's speaker, Richard Polton, I'd ask that you put them in the chat box. You can also put them actually in the Q&A box in the bottom part of your screen. We've used both in the past. Either one, I'll keep an eye out. And so all the questions that you have for Richard, we'll ask him at the end of the presentation tonight so that he can complete his presentation, which will go roughly about an hour or so. And so anyway, so without further ado, I'd like to invite Richard Polton, our speaker for tonight, on his presentation called The Rise and Reconstruction of American City, Paterson, New Jersey in the Victorian Era. Richard, as many of you know, is an architect by trade and is the author of a sort of the standard text on Wentworth, probably Paterson's most famous architect, that he published several years ago. So we're looking forward to this presentation tonight. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. So, so Richard, take it away.
Thank you, Glenn, and good evening, everybody. As Glenn has mentioned, my name is Richard Polton. I'm pleased to be here with you tonight to talk about the city of Paterson and the period of its greatest growth and architectural development. For those of you who know Paterson, I hope that the presentation will give you an understanding of how the city developed and grew during this really dynamic period. And for those of you who are new to the Paterson story, I hope the presentation will give you will introduce you to a city that has an enormously rich history and has played a major role in the growth of New Jersey and, for that matter, the nation. That's a big statement, but let me make my case. Let me say a little bit about me. My family arrived in Paterson in the late 19th century. I grew up on the east side of the city, went to public schools, then off to college, where I studied American urban history and architecture and city planning. After a decade or so of living in New England and then a few years in Brooklyn, my wife and I returned to northern New Jersey very near Paterson and where we raised our children. So I can say that for most of my life, I have lived within 5 or 6 miles of my birthplace. That's something I'm not sure I should admit to. A few years ago, while searching the internet and looking for Paterson memorabilia, I found the story of Fred Wesley Wentworth, an architect who practiced in Paterson from 1890 until his death in 1943. That is another story for another night. He designed many of the buildings that shaped the lives of my parents and grandparents' generations, and me for that matter. The discovery of the Wentworth story led to several years of research. And each spring in the pre-COVID era, I cooperate with the Paterson Historic Commission, and we offer walking tours of downtown. That experience gave me a renewed appreciation for the city, the quality of its architecture, and its growth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I'm sure that most of you know that Paterson is now the home of the Great Falls National Historical Park. Part of the coming improvements is a state-of-the-art visitor center. I have to tell you, it's going to be fantastic. I've been lucky enough to be involved planning the exhibits with colleagues from the Hamilton Partnership, the Friends Group for the National Park, the folks at the National Park Service staff, as well as the Paterson Museum. And we're working with an internationally known exhibit designer, Ralph Applebaum Associates, and the process has really been gratifying. The research has really been a collaboration with the Paterson Museum, who made available a treasure trove of photographs and other images of the city to the group that was working on the exhibits. And while I was looking at all these pictures, I realized that if properly organized, the dramatic story of the city in the period between the end of the Civil War and the 1920s could really be told well. And I began the process of putting them together in a show that you're going to see tonight. So in talking about Paterson, you have to start at the Great Falls, the second largest falls on the east coast of the United States, 77 feet in height, absolutely dramatic and beautiful. It is the iconic location and image of the city. And it's been that way for generations and generations. Like most of northern New Jersey, and I'd like to just run through some of the history. Like most of northern New Jersey, the Paterson area was inhabited by the Lenni Lenape people, and the area around the falls were active Lenape fishing and hunting grounds. Although there is no real record of any permanent settlement, it does loom large in the Lenape story. The earliest European settlers were Dutch, who were attracted to the Great Falls area by descriptions by the Native Americans. In 1679, the Dutch acquired their first tract of land within the bounds of Paterson. And what you're looking at on the slide is a plan for the city that divided up most of the land into small farmsteads that were occupied by the Dutch. So for the first century or so, this was a Dutch settlement, and some of the names that you might see on that map, such as Vreeland, for example, still remain in the city, and that line down the center is actually in line with East 18th Street in the city today. So they had some influence, of course. By 1714, long before Hamilton and the Society for the Establishment of Useful Manufacturers, there were some modest industries such as grist mills and sawmills, but this building that you're seeing was typical of the kind of Dutch settlement that characterized the area for most of the 17th century. It was sparsely settled, and it was really a rural community. As many of you surely know, Alexander Hamilton looms large in the Paterson story. As an aide to General Washington, he camped at the falls as the Revolutionary Army was traveling back and forth throughout northern New Jersey from June in 1778 to the middle of 1780. In July of 1778, Hamilton, along with Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, and their staffs, picnicked on the banks of the Passaic Falls. We can only assume it made an impression because once the nation was founded, Hamilton who became the Secretary of Treasury and strongly advocated for promoting diverse manufacturing in the United States. He convinced Congress and leading sources of funds into supporting this really powerful and transformative idea. In 1791, Hamilton, then the Secretary of the Treasury, was instrumental in forming the Society for the Establishing of Useful Manufacturers, or the SUM. The New Jersey legislature gave the company lots of special incentives to locate here in the state. And these included exemptions from local state and county taxes, the ability to improve rivers and build canals and raise money. The SUM initiated an initial and ambitious plan to build a series of raceways, or to build raceways downstream from the Great Falls and locate factories along those raceways that would produce industries that would be essential to the emerging country and would take advantage of all kinds of the technology that was available at the time. This plan shows several of the development of the raceway system. So several locations were located or identified as potential for the new venture. We can only assume that Hamilton recalled his picnic site as the right setting for a planned industrial city. The falls and the potential for water power was an obvious draw. Proximity to New York and the harbor and lots of buildable land was also an asset. The venture began, funds were raised, and work went underway. The famed planner and architect, an engineer rather, Pierre L'Enfant, the designer of Washington, D.C., was hired to design and build a series of raceways. Well, it all sounds terrific, doesn't it? Land, water power, available funding, connections to powerful leadership, a strong tax advantage, all primed for overnight success. Well, not so fast. I'm sorry. By the 1830s, there were. Hold on, I'm losing. I'm a little bit. Oh, okay. What happened was not the success that the early success that was anticipated. It was a dramatic time. Lots of misadventures, mismanagement, and SUM struggled but survived. It wasn't until the Colt family took over. Let me go back to the mills that were here. The raceway system really took shape, but the economic challenges were significant. By the 1830s, mills started to develop, and there were over 20 cotton mills. Few survived the Depression late in that decade. But an interesting thing happened during this period. The significance of this era to the city was not because the mills were so successful, or that the product was so well received, but because the people who were attracted to this growing enterprise. Professor Herbert Gutman researched the industrial history of Paterson and found that it really was truly a rags to riches story. The early textile manufacturing mattered mainly because it attracted machinists to the city to repair and build cotton and other textile machinery. These men and others who followed after 1840 were in the city at the start of a great boom. And that boom included the manufacture of transportation equipment, machinery, iron goods of all kinds. And between 1830 and 1880, they sparked the development of Paterson's locomotive, iron goods, machine tool industries, changes that in turn spurred the nation's growth. So that was the significance. What you see here on the screen is one of the early mills that developed along the raceway. This was powered by water. It was actually a mill that was making nails for the country at that time. Locomotive manufacture was the first major industry, a consequence of SUM industrialization. Thomas Rogers is typical of the kind of individual who was attracted to the city and was essential for the city's success. He was born in Connecticut in 1792. He was a carpenter who worked through the War of 1812 as a carpenter. He came to Paterson after the war to build power looms and began building machinery for the textile industry in the 1830s. Never actually was a textile manufacturer. He was building machinery. Fate intervened to change the course of his life and the course of the history of the city of Paterson. In 1836, the Paterson and Hudson Railroad purchased an engine in England and had it sent to Paterson to be put together. The engine arrived in parts and was available for study on how it was made. This gave Rogers, a skilled machinist, an opportunity to really look at it up close and personal. Before the engine changed possession, Rogers had drawings and patterns for every part of it. By 1837, he was in business. Over the coming years, he became a major producer and an important local employer. This table shows the slow growth in population up until this period in time. By 1840, there were only 7,500 people living in the city. But very quickly, as industry grew, the population by 1920 would rise to 135,000. And the period between 1870 and 1920 was also an enormous period of growth. And there were times in the late 1800s when Paterson was in fact the fastest growing city in the country. Silk gained a toehold in Paterson in 1840 when John Ryle took possession of a failed silk spinning operation installed by Christopher Colt, part of the Colt family, in the upper floors of the Colt gun mill, where an early version of the famous Colt revolver was manufactured before relocating to Connecticut. Ryle was an immigrant silk worker from Macclesfield, England, an industrial town in the northwest of England, known for its excellent silk and skilled weavers. He made a successful restart producing sewing silk, spooled silk for the sewing machines now being produced in the country by Isaac Singer and others. Macclesfield began a long relationship with the silk industry in Paterson, sending many skilled workers with an extensive knowledge into the city. Other things changed that helped grow the silk industry in Paterson around this time. High tariffs on imported silk products helped American manufacturers and successfully compete with European rivals. Silk was the queen of fibers and dominated high fashion and luxury trade. And women were, and men for that matter, all economic levels wanted their best outfits to be made of silk. And Paterson had advantages in the silk trade. It had abundant water, it had power for processing, and it had good transportation. It was also close to New York City, which was the center of the fashion industry. More importantly, Paterson had, as you can see, a supply of workers who understood the peculiar characteristics of the delicate silk fiber. By 1860, there was an industrial infrastructure of mills, capital, skilled labor, and capable people to run those mills. And within a few years, the city was producing almost half of the silk manufactured in the United States and had earned the reputation as the Silk City, the Lyon of America. Fortunes were made and the city grew. This image shows the largely residential neighborhood beyond the mills, known as Dublin, in an 1858 photo. We're going to be looking in a few minutes at the homes of some of the wealthy mill owners and entrepreneurs. But up until the Victorian era, the post-Civil War era, most of the population lived fairly close together and were in undifferentiated neighborhoods for the most part. The mill owners and entrepreneurs in the early stages weren't living that much differently than the folks who were working in those mills. Dublin became the prototypical New Paterson neighborhood, originally named for Irish workers who came to build the raceway system. Paterson does not have a tradition of factory-owned housing that other textile communities do. Paterson was a place where mill workers could lived independently in their own homes. So Paterson is now poised for growth, and we're going to highlight the architecture and buildings that resulted as a consequence of the city's success during this period. And we're going to highlight three major types of development. First, industrial development. The mills were developed throughout the city. Second, we're going to look at some of the really interesting residential development, the expression of success that came to Paterson's neighborhoods during this period. And we're going to look at the growth of the downtown and the commercial downtown and the government center that developed in Paterson during this period. And as we look at it, here's a map of Paterson in 1877. We're going to be looking at four distinct areas. Area number one, or largely, although things don't always fall in neat categories. Area number one is largely the industrial area that developed around the raceway system initially in Paterson. You can see those buildings are largely in pink. And as mill owners became successful, they moved to the first suburban neighborhood in Paterson, which was the area identified as area number two. And for those of you who knows the city of Paterson, and I hope it's many of you, area number two was essentially on Broadway on the other side of Straight Street, which was the go-to neighborhood for the well-to-do and emerging well-to-do that were coming along in Paterson. Area number 3 is, as you can see in that map, was a large tract. At the beginning of this era, it was a single-family home. It was the home of Roswell Colt, the most successful of the Colt family. And this was a large single-family residence, which we're going to talk about. And as Paterson developed, it was identified as a perfect site for the new governmental center that was needed. And area number 4 is the downtown, focusing around the government buildings and banking buildings that developed near Market Street and the City Hall. And then we'll also be looking at some of the buildings that developed along Main Street, the large commercial area that became the heart of the retail and commercial center of the city. So the first industrial building I want to talk about, which really developed tremendously, was the Rogers locomotive plant. Rogers did more than just copy the design of English manufacturers. He was in fact credited with some important innovations and became an enormously successful builder of the works. Became an enormously successful builder. The Rogers Locomotive Works grew to occupy both sides of Spruce Street. Fortunately, many of those buildings are still standing near Mill Street and Market Street, not far from the Great Falls District. And this is really remarkable. From 1837 to 1900, Rogers produced over 5,600 locomotives, with the peak production years in the 1870s. And the company built a wide array of locomotives. This shows some of them. When you go to the museum, you'll see lots of them. The factory buildings are really worth taking note of. And the significance of the Rogers locomotives goes beyond, has national and international significance. This is a scene at the driving of the Golden Spike that formed the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory Point in Colorado in May of 1869. And the locomotive on the right, with a prominent Rogers sign on it, was in fact there to unite the nation. And you can see the hands are being waved, and it was an important part of the Paterson story and Paterson's contribution to the nation and the unifying power of the railroad system and its impact on all sorts of aspects, good and bad, in American history. But Rogers Rogers grew up around the raceway, but fairly quickly steam engines were developed that could give manufacturers independence and untether them from the raceway system. This is a picture of one of those steam engines that became an important part of Paterson's factory and manufacturing systems. And this next slide shows that the new factories became available to move wherever they needed to, where they had other advantages like locomotive access and weren't reliant on the raceway system for hydropower, for water power. This building that you're seeing is the Royal Machinery Manufacturing business near Grant Street, and it's near railroad tracks away from the raceways. But it's really silk that built the city. And this table shows that the value of silk that was produced in 1880 in Paterson far outstripped all of the competition in other communities. And Paterson was the important silk center. As I said earlier, I believe I said that at the eve of the Civil War, Paterson's silk industry employed around 600 workers, many of whom at the early stages were the wives and daughters of city's machine and locomotive shop workers. Those silk mills were first often located on the sites of former cotton mills. But by 1861, things had really changed, and the growth of this industry was fueled by a change in political climate because the tariffs were instituted after 1861 that protected American industry. And just as importantly, around the same time, there was an Anglo-French trade agreement that opened England's silk market to French goods, and consequently, the silk town, the silk city of Ryle, of Macclesfield, England, was suddenly uncompetitive, and people were seeking another place to go to carry on their trade, and Paterson turned out to be the perfect place. So that quickly, from an industry that was employing 600, the silk industry grew to employ over 20,000 in Paterson. These are 6 of the major silk mills that were constructed during this era. And these were designed exclusively for silk production. Paterson was famous for ribbon and broad silk weaving, and the value of the fiber and the value of the product were so significant that that buildings were designed to make manufacturing relatively clean, relatively sunny or bright with natural light, although working conditions were hardly wonderful. The working day was long, 10 hours, and by 1913, with a half a day on Saturday, and wages were low. However, because the products were so valuable, the silk mills were generally clean, and silk threads had to be watched carefully, so good lighting was critical. The mills were multi-story for the most part because they being near the energy source to drive the belts and drive the machineries was a challenge, and couldn't run over long distances. So it was easy to go up and high. So the buildings tended to be fairly narrow, fairly high, and the industry grew successfully. So there were over 270 silk mills later by 1910. But these are the major ones that we're going to take a quick look at. This is the LAMBERT silk mill, and the workers who came here were largely from silk textile communities in England, Germany, Switzerland, Italy during this era, and later opened up to Syria and Eastern Europe. Nearly half the workers were women, but men dominated the best paying jobs. And children could work beginning at age 14, and might spend a good portion of their life working in the silk. The workers might move up to skilled jobs like a weaver, a loom fixer, or in some cases an independent manufacturer. But it was a very tough life, and tensions grew between between labor and owners. Here's another image of another major silk mill, and you can see again the muscular design, the bringing in of lots of light, the verticality of the brickwork, the big open windows, the monitor up on top. And this is the Dougherty and Wadsworth Mill. Here's an image of what it looked like inside one of the silk mills during this period. You can see lots of belts and pulleys. A tough way to earn a living. This is the Strange Mill. Mr. Strange was one of the early, most successful mill owners in the city. He began in the Civil War era and grew to be one of the larger silk manufacturers. Here's again an image inside one of the silk mills. And it wasn't just silk, the weaving of silk, dyeing of silk and other fabrics became a critically important industry in Paterson. The proximity to the river, the availability of lots of water, all of which were essential for silk, for dyeing, made the industry very successful. And there were 10,000 people working in the silk in the dyeing industry. And these are some of the plants. And the dyeing plants tend to be horizontal because they involve lots of water, lots of big tanks, and horizontal movement. There wasn't much manufacturing going on. It was moving and moving the materials and stretching them out and making sure that the work was consistent. It was a very, very difficult job, and the conditions were very harsh. And in Paterson, the silk dyers tended to be Southern Italians who came into the country as unskilled workers and found employment in the silk dyeing industry. And there was more to Paterson industry than just silk. This is a picture of the Barber flax spinning mill. The Barbers arrived in Paterson in 1864, and the family was part of a Northern Ireland enterprise that had been in the flax business for a century when they arrived, more than a century when they arrived in Paterson. And the Paterson branch of the family started as importers, then found their way into Paterson and became major manufacturers. And you can see some of their complexes here. And in this image here, this is a building on Spruce Street, which still exists. And life in the mills, particularly for many of the more established mills, was a way of life. It wasn't just a place to work. This is a picture of the Barber baseball team. It says Barber Grand Street on their uniforms, and again around the same time. So Paterson was more than just silk manufacturing. I want to show some images of some breweries that were major employers in the city. Those of you who know Paterson know the name Hinchcliffe for sure. The Hinchcliffe family were involved in various enterprises in the city, but most notably they were brewers and built this brewery that stood in Paterson. This is what's left of it. You can see some of the detail remains. This niche for a god of beer and grain still exists in what's left of the building. Off of Straight Street. This is another one of the breweries, the Katz Brothers Brewery. And this one, what a fantastic image, the Consolidated Brewery. I'm not sure how you'd categorize the architecture of that, but I guess it's Germanic in its design, but it was quite a place. And as all these folks became successful, they began building homes. And I want to go through some of the really interesting Victorian homes that were were constructed in that period between 1850 and 1920 or 1910, but focusing on things that you probably haven't seen before, and they are really quite striking. This is the home of Garrett A. Hobart, who many of you know was one of Paterson's leading citizens, an important political leader in the city, an important and consequential attorney who headed up SUM and was involved in many of the utilities in town, served in the state legislature as a state senator, and then went on to serve the Republican Party as an important fundraiser and member, and ultimately was selected to be William McKinley's vice president, and would have been the United States president had he not passed away while in office before McKinley was assassinated. This is his home, and it really is a transitional piece from, or work from, the earlier federal style and later Victorian architecture. It doesn't have all of the elaborate decorative elements that high Victorian architecture has, but you can see the windows are narrowing and have arches. There's the big front porch. There are the volumes are broken up into several sections, as you can see here. This was on Carroll Street. Here's another period where the Victorian architecture is starting to take hold. A big tall tower, more Italianate design, more decorative elements. Again, a big front porch. Again, these are all built in that area along Broadway, between Broadway and Madison Avenue for the most part. And this is the home of Henry Crosby, who was Paterson's leading food merchant at the time. This was one of the landmark buildings of the period. It was really considered quite elaborate and quite handsome. And the spot where it stands was, when he purchased it and began the erection of the building, was a cornfield. Its architecture was different from any of the other houses that had been erected in the city. And according to reports in the 1890s, people would come from all over the area to see this house and see the structure. Now, this building has one other important and significant aspect to it. It became the Miriam Barnard Dispensary in the 1890s, which was the first home of what would become the Barnard Hospital. You've heard of Nathan Barnard, who was a Jewish leader of the city, born in Prussia in 1838. He immigrated to New York at the age of 11, ventured to California for the big gold rush in the 1840s. And he came to Paterson after he lost his fortune at a gambling table in San Francisco to begin a very successful career in real estate and politics, and was an important part of the city's scene. But he, as part of his philanthropic efforts, started a dispensary in honor of his wife in this building, and then later moved it to the Barnard Hospital further down Broadway in the east side. But I want to focus on some of the other residential buildings that were developing during this period. Isn't this an incredible house? This is the home of Robert Hamill, a silk manufacturer who had a Swiss background. This is an elaborate Italianate design, and it's really done on a grand scale with the big porch and the arched entryway and the, the, the tower, Widow's Walk, whatever that's up on top, and the elaborate landscaping. Look at that statue in front. Here's the home of William Ryle, another prominent silk manufacturer. He was the president of the Paterson Board of Trade and was a nephew of John Ryle, the leading silk manufacturer in the city. This is an English style home. Look at the verticality of those chimneys, the peaked roof with the arched windows, reminiscent of English period, English manner architecture. And William Ryle married the daughter of, married Mary Danforth, who was the daughter of Charles Danforth, another prominent locomotive manufacturer in the city. Another spectacular home that lined Broadway. And here's two more to show you. The top one is Henry Dougherty's home, and the bottom one is that of James Morrissey. Dougherty was one of the big silk manufacturers and partner of Wadsworth. Morrissey was a real estate and banking leader. These homes really look like they belong in Ocean Grove in New Jersey, or Cape May at the least, or maybe Rumson and whatnot. Spectacular, huge homes. And I guess I have to just point out that all of these homes were built before the institution of an income tax. So when these leading entrepreneurs were able to make a lot of money and keep it. This is and had those dollars to invest in their homes. This is the home of John Reynolds, which is sort of a precursor of the shingle style that McKinley and White were responsible for, especially in Newport. Big volumetric, triangular peaked roof at the front, big porch. And this is another silk manufacturer, Jacob Horant, another silk merchant or silk manufacturer with Swiss background. Look at the elaborate detailing on this house. And again, on Broadway, what a lifestyle this must have been. What a statement about the success of first generation mill owners. And this is the home of William Strange. We saw his mill earlier, and this is the home that he lived in. And this is the home of William Nelson, who was a prominent historian and title company operator in Paterson. He knew every piece of real estate in the city and was very successful and important in documenting the city's history and several important histories and books that are still in use today. And finally, I wanted to show you the home and business of John Norwood. And we talk about a Victorian tour de force. Here you can see his downtown business filled with paint, and it must have been a showcase in the Victorian era for the colors that were so popular. And then his home on the other side of the image. I don't have a picture of the actual home that he lived in, but this is the rendering of what he lived in. And finally, the most important home of the decade or of this era, the home of Catalina Lambert, who was born in Yorkshire, England in 1834, and came from a working class background. Found his way ultimately to Paterson, and obviously a success in the silk, a giant success in the silk industry, up until the Great Strike of 1913, when he suffered a remarkable reverse. But here's his home, and this is shows the portico of his gallery. This is a front-on view of the home. And this is the art gallery that he had in his personal collection, which included Rembrandts, Botticelli's, and Pissarro's, and was open to the people of Paterson on a regular basis. And sadly, it's one of the tragedies is that the people of Paterson lost out on this treasure when this collection was sold in 1914, when Lambert, who mortgaged his home and property to weather the strike, found himself in financial distress. Just quickly, some other later homes that were developed on the east side in the Victorian era. Several of those designed by Wentworth. This is the home of John Griggs on the top. That site, John Griggs was another critically important Patersonian, prominent attorney, went on to become Attorney General of the United States. So at one point, Paterson had a vice president and an attorney general, both from the same community. So that gives you an indication of the economic and political significance that Paterson had at that time. And this is a picture of the Barber Estate as you cross the Passaic River, driving up Broadway with East Side Park on your left. That was the Barber Estate that was part of the Barber family presence in the city of Paterson. I quickly want to go through houses of worship that were developed during this period. All of these were developed prior to 1880. The most important of which, or the most notable of which, is probably this St. John's Catholic Church, which is now the cathedral in the city. But all of these show the revival of the Gothic style that became prevalent during this period. That was largely spurred when Richard Upjohn designed Trinity Church in 1848. Fashions really changed from a more puritanical and traditional or simplified church to more elaborate Gothic churches. And St. John's was built by congregants over a 30-year period. These show some of the other churches built during this Victorian era, which recall English country churches or more elaborate Dutch-style churches that were prevalent. Here's the picture of St. John's Cathedral, which was designed by a very noteworthy church architect, P.C. Kiley, who did the cathedral in Boston and Chicago, and also designed churches in numerous textile cities along the east, up and down the east coast of the United States, who suddenly populated by Catholic workers, immigrants who came into those cities to work in the mills. And with the growth of the Catholic Church, he found lots of work. And this church took 30 years to build and was built on what they called a day's work volunteer labor system. And it was dedicated in 1870, recently been restored. It's really quite handsome. This is the first African-American church in Paterson. This is Zion AME Church. There's been a Black community in Paterson since its beginning. It had its own community functions, one of which was this church and a variety of social clubs. And it was a significant force in the city's social history. And finally, I want to show you a view looking up Broadway in Paterson. There's two houses of worship, a Protestant church on the left, and the first major Jewish synagogue in town, B'nai Jeshurun, the Barnard Temple, and done in the Moorish style, designed in 1899. The architect was a New York architect named John Post. Land was donated by Nathan Barnard, the real estate and political leader of the town, a political real estate leader of the town. And I'm going to show you the interior. This is the interior of the Barnard Temple on March 31st, 1962. And I can attest personally to the condition and design of the building, because that's me on the bema there in front of the open Torah ark at my bar mitzvah in 1962. Moving on to some of the other buildings that were developed during this period of note, social clubs. This is an Italian palazzo plunked down on the corner of Church and Ellison Street by Paterson's leading business people. Look at the oversized cornice. It was the leading men's club that where mill owners and political leaders and everyone in between at the upper strata of society at Paterson were members. This is a Masonic temple. Paterson had lots of Masonic buildings during this period, and of course, the consolidated later in the 20th century in a building on Broadway, but there were Masonic temples throughout the city. This was a women's club that operated in the city that largely attracted the upper middle class and upper class women in town. And ethnic groups of various stripes developed their own clubs. This is the Turn Hall, which was sponsored by the German community in Paterson, but it became an important center for workers during the strike in 1913. Here's the workers leaving or entering a meeting that was taking place in Turn Hall. And there were others of various ethnic origins that were scattered throughout the city. There was Helvetia Hall, which was built by Swiss immigrants. There was there was a Druid Hall, which appealed to the English immigrants from Macclesfield, and various other ethnic clubs and organizations in the downtown. Then now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the evolution of the downtown. This is a study. I think you're going to find these images really quite remarkable. Those of you who know Paterson, this is Broadway and Washington Street. This is what it looked like in probably the late 1860s. Horse-drawn carriages. And because this is the Victorian age, this is a large Second Empire building. This was probably the Our building was one of the largest buildings in the city, and had meeting halls on the upper floors, retail on the lower floors, and other kinds of clubs. You can see they sold ice cream right on the ground floor. But isn't that a handsome building? And it didn't make it past the 1880s, when apparently a fire burnt it down. And here's a picture that I found in the collection of the Paterson Museum that I just think we all have to share and appreciate. Here are a herd of elephant marching through downtown Paterson. You can see that Barnum is in town, and Barnum started in 1871. So this picture is probably sometime in the 1870s. But you can see the basic standard, fairly plain buildings that were lining this end of Broadway during this period. But that was to change. Our building is now gone, and this building replaces it, larger, more elaborate, and next to it is a true Victorian work of the Paterson Morning Call building. Here it is as it looked when constructed, and here's a parade going by it. Probably this is Garrett Hobart's funeral procession, and this is the ground floor of that building. But again, look at the context of and vibrancy of downtown Paterson, the activity and building that's lining the streets. Here's another parade, and then this is how the building evolved, and this is what it looks like today. Let me go quickly through the transformation of the government center. As I discussed, this was Roswell Colt's home. He built it in 1843, and it was the greatest mansion in Paterson on us, and the site was called Colt Hill. And here he entertained the nation's political and business elite. In this home, he pursued his broad interests, which include botany and geology and science. And he lived a rather grand lifestyle, although in later years he also took some financial risks that jeopardized his financial standing. Here's a map of that mansion. Roswell Colt, when he was running SUM, was fairly conscious of making the city more attractive towards and somewhat more livable for the new communities that were coming in, and sold off or donated a corner of the site, which is where the Roman Catholic Church is. But the large tract remained vacant through the 1880s and early 1890s. And this again is a picture of that home, and this became the site where the federal government built a new post office in the 1890s in this Dutch style. Again, one of the more handsome and striking buildings. The federal government at this point was building lots of buildings and reinforcing the national presence, building courthouses and post offices throughout the country, and through the Department of Treasury, where they had an architectural staff. And this was done probably to recall the early Dutch settlers that came here. And shortly thereafter, the county decided to build a courthouse. So we have the contrast between the classically inspired court complex and the Dutch Renaissance building on the side. Here's an image of an influential building that probably shaped the design. And this is what it looks like on a sunny day today. Let me talk to you briefly about the City Hall area. The building that you see on the slide now was originally started as the home for Peter Colt, who was brought in to run SUM. And this is where he built this home. The beginning, not the lower floor, that was later added, but he built this in 1813. Again, a classical building with a gambrel style roof, and 2 stories high, that stood where the old police station on Washington Street stands now. It was seen as it was minimal and not befitting the newly established prestige of the city of Paterson. So, as part of the centennial celebration, the city decided to build a new city hall, had a competition, ended up hiring the architectural firm of Carrere and Hastings, which famous for the New York Public Library, one of the real prestige firms in the country at that time. And they designed a building that was befitting the Lyon of America. And what did they do? They went and took a look at Lyon, and this is their city hall. And if you notice, the tower on top is very reminiscent of the tower in our city hall in Paterson. And this was a time when American architects were studying at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And Paris in French design was really all the rage. So what you see on the right is the second National Bank, also done in a very elaborate French style. Here's a picture of it when first constructed. Really quite something. And as Glenn will report, during this in 1904, there was 1903, there was a remarkable fire, the largest fire in New Jersey history, that really devastated good chunks of the city. Everything in red was destroyed by fire, including the city hall area. This is where we were, and buildings were destroyed. This also a really quite remarkable French influenced building was the First National Bank, just behind the existing city hall on Ellison Street and Church Street. It was destroyed in that fire. It was replaced by another Carrere and Hastings building that you see here. And here are several bank buildings that were, many of which are French influenced, that were built during this period. This is the Silk City Deposit, a masonry bearing wall systems building that has enormously thick walls at the base. Here is another bank building that was built during this period. This is the Colt building, which was designed by Alexander McIntosh, who designed the Rhinelander Mansion on Madison Avenue in New York, which is now the home of Ralph Lauren and his brand. Still exists, still next to the city. This is called the L'Enfant building, another Alexander McIntosh building. The ground floor was a bank, and the upper floors were offices and apartments. This is the Hamilton Trust. Again, French influence. This was a time in France when the Pantheon was being restored and was all the rage in the 1880s. So this building became Paterson's showcase, and it was interesting because it was more than just a bank building. This street corner, as you can see here in this picture, became a de facto exchange. According to the WPA guide that was written in the 1930s, they reported that silk manufacturers constitute a curb exchange sidewalk trading along Washington Street between Ellison and Market Streets. From early morning until late afternoon, manufacturers mill around, selling raw silk, buying finished silk, sight unseen. Here, family shop operators contract to weave to contract and weave converters raw silk on a commission basis. All of the industry, skilled workers would come to look for work. It was the center of the silk industry up until the end of the 1930s, when the bank had a run on it during the Depression. But this picture gives you an image of Paterson and the City Hall area as a French influenced design. Here's a few other noteworthy buildings. Here's, you'll get a kick out of this. This is the evolution of Main and Market Street. This building that you see is called Congress Building. And you can see where the City Hall was later developed. This was a church that was demolished, purchased and demolished to build the new City Hall at the center of the town. And look at the Victorian building to the left of Congress Hall, built again during this 1870s period. Congress Hall became far more valuable, and the Paterson Institution for Savings building was built, and you can see that the remaining building, the building next door, remains up until this time period. This was an important building in the Paterson fire story because it served as a fire stop and kept the fire from spreading. And you can see what the Main Street looked like before the fire. It was lots of wood frame buildings, lots of overhead wires. It really looked like a fire hazard when you think about it. And here's the first replacement of the Victorian building to the left. And the site was so valuable that a third building was built on that site. And that was a Wentworth design, and it stands today. And you can see the City Hall in the background. And of course, Paterson had its great stores. This was the Meyer Brothers store before the fire, and this is what replaced it. Meyer Brothers was a leading department store. Many of you remember, I hope. At its heyday, a fabulous place to shop with just about everything available. And its rival across the street was the Quackenbush store. This is also a replacement of the building that burnt during the fire. Quackenbush was an important competitor, and this building still exists. Unfortunately, Meyer Brothers burnt and has been demolished. And downtown Paterson has a few other buildings of note that I wanted to point out. This is a classic tobacconist's. This is the Dunning store. Dunning was, I think, a name that many of you may remember. Even I think the name lasted for many years. And here's the cigar store Indian in front of the Dunning store. And I just wanted to show this slide, which shows the transformation of the Scheuer building on Main Street. It started as a grocery store that was built in 1887, and then it got a new cornice on top, and it became a 5 and 10 store with a Chinese restaurant on the second floor and a foreign service post on the third floor. The multiplicity of uses tells you how important and dynamic the real estate market was, and all these upper floors were important in their use. And then it evolved into the SS Kresge store. Again, the Chinese restaurant remained, but it became part of the national store. This building, I think, is another fascinating building, an important building in downtown. Looks like a Chicago-style Louis Sullivan almost building with ground floor retail and commercial buildings upstairs. It was an important household furnishings and farming store. It was an important and handsome building in the city. And here you can see some of the other buildings that lined Main Street that showed some elaborate Victorian influences. Charles W. Elbow was a famous haberdashery that, as advertised, was the highest grade of men's clothing during that era. Elbow built this building even and occupied part of the ground floor for a while, but it was part of his his domain on the corner of Main Street and Market Street. This building is a Wentworth building, but you can see how elaborately designed it was and influenced by Chicago-style architecture. This is a steel frame building with large open windows, lots of decoration still. You can see the elbow name on top. And when I was looking at this slide, for those of you who knew Paterson and grew up in Paterson, you can see there's some writing on the awning, and I blew that up, and it says Eclipse Talking Machines, Victrolas and Records. And Eclipse has a memory for many of us. That was the place where we would go to buy our records across the street from City Hall on Church Street, right by the City Hall. So it's apparently it started way back when and continued through the 1970s. So by the early 20th century, the economic model that shaped Paterson really was ending. The days of the vibrant integrated silk industry were just not competitive. There was not that much developable real estate for major changes. There was no demand for new mills. The inventory of space could be met. Labor troubles had affected the city's reputation. The silk industry left the area slowly. There was competition for the industry. There were sites that offered less expensive labor. Silk dyeing and machine works, such as the Curtis Wright plant, remained really important, and in some cases expanded during this period. The city remained really a center of the region's commercial, retail, and entertainment activity for many, many decades. And this, for those of you who weren't convinced that Paterson is the center of the universe, of the known universe anyway, this public service transit guide shows how accessible Paterson was from all points around. And it did serve as the banking and retail and financial center for the region for many, many years to come, and is finding a new way now, a new direction. And I just want to highlight that there are things to look forward to. Here is an image of the visitor center that's coming to the Great Falls National Park. This will be at the overlook. You can see where the statue of Alexander Hamilton is, and the hydro plant that's off to the side. And here's what it would look like from the side facing the falls, with those big windows looking out onto the falls, and more activity along the waterfront. So there's a lot to look forward to. And I want to thank you all for your patience and attention. I have to say, I really miss giving this in front of a live audience. I miss the feedback, knowing when I'm connecting and when I'm not. So thank you for putting up with a long speech and a long presentation. But I really want to thank all of you for attending, my friends and family. I feel the vibrations through Zoom, and I really appreciate your attending. And I also want to thank the Paterson Museum, the Hamilton Partnership, my friends there, and my friends who are on who many of whom I grew up with, and have remained interested and amused by my love and passion for the city, and of course for my family for helping and supporting my interest in this city, where we have deep roots. So thank you, and I hope there's some questions or chats. I didn't see anything. So Glenn, I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for an excellent presentation. Yes, we have a bunch of comments thanking you. Fantastic job. all sorts of accolades. So, which I'll add to the pile. And one
Those
person
are
we
those are the
like to
family
mention.
members, I think.
Okay. Well, one person I like to mention tonight is Dave Ferrari. He's the man. He's the IT, the wizard behind the curtain, making this presentation possible tonight. So he's behind our logo. So thanks to Dave as well. A couple questions. One deals with a couple of them actually asked about surviving buildings. Would you agree that when it comes to the sort of commercial downtown buildings and the houses of worship, that statistically there's many more survivors there than there are, for example, for a lot of the residential buildings that you showed?
Yes.
Would you agree to that?
Yeah, I would agree with it. And let's see if we can help analyze what happened. You're right that the commercial buildings, those that weren't destroyed by, Paterson didn't have the large widespread urban renewal that cleared the downtown. They cleared portions of it, the area where the Garden Theater was, where One Hamilton Plaza is, was also a developed site. But and there was the planned peripheral highway that demolished some buildings. But fortunately, that ran into the workings of Mary Ellen Kramer and the movement for historic preservation that we all really admire and benefit from today. So for the most part, the downtown and a lot of the mill buildings, we had a terrible rash of fires that cost us lots of important buildings, but there's still a lot left. The residential buildings that you saw, which were so striking because it's hard to believe that those buildings lined Broadway and that was a premier location during the Gilded Age. But they went for the most part because they were economically much more valuable as commercial development for an apartment house or for a retail store or because fashions changed and it was they were no longer viable as large single family homes, and people could no longer afford to maintain those properties. A lot of them, those were largely lost. Although when you drive down Broadway to this day, you can see several are left. But and the introduction of vinyl siding and other forms of siding have taken the joy out of their preservation, because it's not like visiting Newport or Cape May or Rumson, for that matter, where they have buildings of this vintage that are beautifully maintained. So and then the other, so if they weren't demolished, they were neglected, and we've lost a lot through either things got much better and there was a higher and better use, or they got much worse and they fell apart.
Exactly. We've got a question from John about, I'll answer this one about the fire. He asked how the fire started. So the Great Fire in 1902, we actually don't know how it started. We know where it started, but not how. We think it was probably a leftover unattended heating appliance inside one of the trolley cars that was inside a famous building called the Wigwam. So if you want to watch that, it's a separate YouTube video, like this one will be on the YouTube Paterson Museum's channel. So you can watch the entire presentation about the Great 1902 fire. We got a question about, or a comment perhaps, about 24.5 Van Houten Street. Richard, that's of course, the industry mill, later became Fabric Color, under development. Any thoughts as an architect about that project?
I couldn't highlight every mill in Paterson. There were so many architecturally significant mills, and that's what is great about the city, is that they form a district that hopefully will be much more pedestrian friendly and user friendly over the coming years. That's the hope and dream of seeing Hinchcliffe Stadium restored and the visitor center on its way, and all the good work that the National Park is doing with the Quarry Lawn project that's on its way, combined with other. We need to get the Paterson Museum building renovated and up to speed, because it's a first-rate part of our architectural heritage. We need to do more, but I know that there's plans afoot for the Fabricolor building. I've been through it. It's what's great about it is it backs right onto the river, so it really feels like it could be a prototype for some interesting redevelopment. And I just wanted to add one thing to Glenn's comment about the fire, which makes Paterson especially interesting in the downtown. And I point that out in the walking tour, is that we are a living museum of architecture in a limited period of time, because so many of the buildings that form our downtown were built in the post-fire era. And so you can really see the particularly along Main Street and Church Street and Ellison Street, you can see the array of architectural styles that were circulating through the profession and fashion during that period. And that's one of the things that makes Paterson so incredibly interesting to see on the ground, looking up at the buildings. And you'll see so many of them have a date of 1904. The fire was 1902. I'm sorry, I got a little muddled about that when I was talking, but so many of the buildings, the city was an economic dynamo, and there was a rush to get back up to speed. It may be a lost opportunity from a city planning point of view, because so many cities, when they had these devastating fires, rethought their plan. Paterson said, no, we've got to get back in business as quickly as possible. So we lost out on the Central Park in Paterson that might have come along, but we got some great and interesting architecture that is still, a lot of which is still there. Needs a lot of TLC, but at least it's still there.
Excellent. So I'll ask just one more comment from Jerry, and we'll wrap it up for tonight. He's curious about Fabian, his home still in existence, and also what your thoughts are on the legacy of Temple Emmanuel and where it's headed.
Look, it's as part of that community in Paterson that grew up on the East Side and knew the influence and significance of Fabian and Temple Emmanuel, and in writing the Wentworth book, learning about the relationship between Wentworth, this blue blood Yankee from Dover, New Hampshire, and Jacob Fabian, an immigrant, the friendship that developed that became personal to the point that Wentworth was a pallbearer at Fabian's funeral. It's a sad story in many ways. The home that Fabian lived in on the east side of Paterson is still around. And in fact, if the public is interested, I'd be glad to do another of these webinars on Fabian and his career and in Paterson and elsewhere, and his relationship with the architect. But his story, the architect Wentworth, but his story goes beyond that, and it is an amazing story, absolutely remarkable.
And just as the story tonight was very amazing too, Richard. So we want to thank you for your wonderful presentation. Again, this lecture will be posted to the YouTube channel for the Paterson Museum Foundation probably next week or two. So if you want to send it to a friend, certainly do that. I'd also remind you in the chat room that I placed the link to our donation page if you feel so inclined to help us out at the Paterson Museum Foundation. So I want to thank you all tonight for coming. Richard, thank you for the presentation. And we look forward to seeing you all virtually on another lecture. So thank you so much.